Good morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is confidence. And I made a really interesting discovery with a client yesterday that relating to confidence and how our well, I'll dig into it in a couple minutes. But before we get started, let's just take a couple minutes to settle in and get present. And so let's take a deep breath in through your nose, hold it, and imagine incredibly crisp and clean oxygen just flooding your lungs and flowing into your bloodstream and nourishing all your cells and all your organs. And as you exhale, exhale any stress or any tension and allow your shoulders to relax. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose. Hold it, in this time, imagine sparkling white light lighting up all the molecules and electrons in your body and beyond, connecting you with the universe. And as you exhale, exhale any remaining stuckness or tension. And now let's just gently press our palms together and really softly feel the deliciousness of rubbing your fingers against your palms and feel the tingling and tickling in your fingertips and in your palms, and allow yourselves to become present right now to the deliciousness of being here in this body for this physical experience. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Good morning. I'm really excited to share this revelation with you. I've been working with a client on self confidence, and uh, I through our explorations together, I was able to synthesize some pieces that hadn't really made a whole lot of, that I hadn't seen the connection between before. Good morning, Tammy. Welcome, welcome. I'm really glad you're here. We're talking about confidence this morning and what the dynamic is behind it and how we can shift our experience of it. So, this sort of brought together some pieces that may be obvious once we connect them, but initially it wasn't an obvious connection for me originally. So, um, what is tied in with confidence? Well, one of the primary things that's tied in with our sense of confidence is our sense of identity, right? That's an obvious connection. However, this good morning, well, good afternoon, Hope. I'm so glad to have you here with us. Welcome. We're talking about confidence. So, I was working with this client, and this person was uh, pretty much a perfectionist, and I think that that's a an identity that a lot of us can relate to. And I'm working on the assumption here that we have multiple identities. We don't just have one. We take on multiple roles and identities, and maybe the thing that's unique to us is the assemblage of all these different personas and identities. But anyway, being something of a perfectionist, this person I've spoken of before had an identity of being a high achiever. And I had inquired of them what the expectations of themselves were as a high achiever. And as a high achiever, their expectation of themselves was that they always would be performing, that they'd always be excellent in everything they did. And we've got a couple words there that should bring up red flags, right? Always, for one, because always is sort of an impossible standard to begin with. And always perform, excellently, always perform really well. And so the challenge with that is not that that's, on the surface, being a high achiever is a is what something we might consider to be a positive identity. However, there was a tremendous expectation that was unachievable on as a human being, to always be performing at your best, to always be excellent at something. And what we realized was that in his identity for himself, he was unable to um, give allowance for himself to make mistakes and to be able to grow, because how we learn is by making mistakes or doing something less than perfectly, right? So the way that we learn and the way that we grow is to, as I say, fail forward, fail fast, fail forward. um, and as we quote unquote fail and make corrections, we're constantly making or adjustments, self-correcting. It's that GPS kind of thing that we've spoken about before, where you're constantly course correcting. And so what we recognized is that his sense of confidence was tied into this identity, because what happens is when you have an identity as a peak performer, or a I'm always going to do my best, or I'm always going to excel, uh, anything pretty much with an always attached to it has some sense of oppression to it, because it's a standard that nobody can live up to all the time. And I'm using lots of uh, global terms here. When I say nobody can live up to all the time, I would venture to guess that that is a truth, although who knows, there may be a person who could challenge that. Hello, Christina. Good morning. I'm really glad you're here. We're talking about confidence. And so we're talking about how our identities are laden with unspoken, unrecognized expectations. And so, with an expectation that I'm always going to be a peak performer and I'm always going to excel, it doesn't give me the opportunity as an individual to be a human being, to not do things perfectly, to actually suck at some things. Like, it's okay to suck at some things. And we're not all equally talented in all things. And so, in what was amazing about this is, if you look at having an identity that has the oppression of the always sort of expectation as part of it, what happens in our relationship to ourselves? Well, inevitably, we're going to encounter situations where we don't perform to our standard, where if for instance I'm a peak performer and I'm always excelling, then when there's a situation when I make a mistake or when I don't excel, then what happens is it's a betrayal of my sense of self, or it breeds disappointment in myself, for myself. And with that disappointment comes a um, a lack of trust for myself, right? Because I can't trust myself to perform to my highest standard and my high expectation. And so if I can't trust myself, I'm always looking for places where I might screw up. What's going to go wrong now? How did I mess that up? Right? Because I'm having this incredible expectation that doesn't allow me my my foibles as a human being, right? So I'm wondering if you're with me, because these are pieces that just sort of assembled in an unlikely or an unanticipated way. It kind of became something of a revelation for me with all of this. So by adjusting his definition of himself, he was able to allow himself to the context that he created instead was, I I have an intention to use every experience or my experiences as learning opportunities, right? So I am a learner. So that was a definition for himself that allowed for him to make mistakes, that allowed for him to not be perfect, that allowed for him to grow and change and evolve and not be great at everything. And in that, and this is the really amazing and beautiful thing about this, in that giving himself permission to be a human being, then what resulted of that from that was that he could trust himself to learn from his experiences, and he could trust himself to be evolving and to have a commitment to his own evolution. And with that commitment and that self-trust, he was able to gain a confidence that he hadn't previously had, an ease, in other words, that permitted him to make mistakes. And so it's such a magical kind of dynamic, and something that you wouldn't necessarily expect, because confidence is often perceived as someone feeling like they're infallible, but it isn't about that. What confidence is truly about is self-trust, trusting yourself to be able to respond to a situation, being present. That's what confidence ultimately is. Like, the people who are truly confident aren't really even having a conversation about confidence. They're just being present and responsive to circumstances, right? There's an evenness, or as we came up with in our conversation, an inner integrity, that inner integration that is perceived as confidence, right? Because when we have a trust for ourselves, then we're not constantly bracing against the onslaught of external circumstances. We're not constantly looking for the next thing that we're going to do wrong, because we have the ability to recover from doing something wrong. And what we've done ultimately, and this is the key, is that we have separated our performance from our sense of self-worth. So we're not making our sense of self-worth reliant upon how we how we show up in the world, in a way. So um, we're in other words, separating I made a mistake from I'm worthless. Okay. Instead, I made a mistake and it has nothing to do with my self-worth. And that that is the foundation of what we're talking about as confidence. And I'm wondering how this is landing for you, how you're relating to these ideas of, first of all, our expectations of ourselves, recognizing what is my expectation of myself, and is that expectation a self-defeating formula? Is the expectation that I'm a peak performer, is that a positive expectation of yourself? a positive definition of yourself? Because if you're a peak performer, is there room within that identity to allow yourself to not be a peak performer when you're not? You know, to not be perfect at everything you do, to allow yourself your humanity. So how does this land for you? How does it feel to give yourself permission and to recognize the identities? Hello, Danette. Welcome, welcome. So Christina says, if we don't allow being wrong, we can actually block what's right. Well, that's a beautiful, beautiful insight. And in fact, what this person realized is that by allowing themselves um, to not, to not have that definition of themselves, what they realized was that they were allowing themselves to take action because it was okay if the action they took wasn't the right or perfect action. So in other words, by giving yourself the bandwidth to be able to make mistakes, then you have a greater ability to take action, in fact, because it's going to be good or it's not going to be good, and it's still okay. So in other words, we can trust ourselves to be able to take corrective action if need be, that we can trust ourselves to be responsive. So by having this notion that we always have to do it right is a paralyzing experience. And as a recovering perfectionist, I can attest to that so much of my struggle in my earlier life was about confronting the fear of not doing something correctly. And oftentimes, because I knew I couldn't do it perfectly, or because I knew I couldn't do it um, right, so to speak, or as well as somebody else, I didn't even try so many things that I wanted to, or was drawn to trying. Because, for instance, yesterday we were talking about art and painting, and for instance, I wouldn't even, in the past, there were things like I wouldn't try painting because there were so many people that were so much better at it than I was, or than I thought I could ever be. Why even try? And if you look at that, that's a little bit crazy. It's a little bit of a crazy idea, because why was I drawn to painting? Was it to be the best painter in the world? No. Why was I drawn to painting? Because there was something creative in me that wanted to be expressed. And so I think so many of us don't even try something because we have this story about it's too late. Well, it's too late. Why? Maybe it's too late because we're not going to be excellent at it, or we're not going to be the best at it, or we're not going to get the results that we want. And so this comes back to the whole conversation about separating the external, and that's exactly what this person did to find their experience of confidence. It was so profound, by separating the external outcome from the internal inspiration and experience. So, like, I don't know that I'll ever create any kind of great art, but that's not going to stop me from being engaged in the creative process, because the process, the inspiration, is what is moving through me, and what enlivens me. It's not the outcome. It's not whether I end up being a recognized artist. That's not my objective. My objective is to be in the creative process. And so being engaged in the process of life itself, being able to be present, being able to be responsive, being able to give ourselves the freedom in our identities and our definitions and expectations of who we are and how we show up in the world, gives us the ability to have that deeper sense of self-trust from which the appearance of confidence emerges. And I'm saying the appearance of confidence emerges because I don't know that people who are truly perceived as confident have that conversation internally, like I'm confident. They're more just engaged and present. And Christina says, I've had experience with someone that's so consumed with the illusion of what she believes others' idea of perfection is that she can't lead her real authentic life. And thank you for that, Christina. You bring up a really good point, and that is the experience of confidence, or the truth of confidence comes from shifting our focus from the judgment of others, which is really ultimately self-judgment. So, like, here's the thing: when we're consumed with the notion of what others think or about us, or perceive about us, or judge about us, then what's really going on is that there is an internal insecurity that is looking for outward validation, right? First of all, we can't control what other people think of us. And that's just the baseline. So attaching our value, our personal sense of value, to what other people think of us is problematic, because there's nothing you can do about what they think. You could change your behavior potentially, but you still don't get to control how they react to it. And people are going to react the way they react. Obviously, if you perceive people's responses and there's a consistent response, it's a clue to you that something's going on in your behavior that you may or may not want to shift, and you can gain some insight. But I don't know who said this original quote, but other people's opinion of me is none of my business, in a certain regard, because people's opinions of you are a reflection of their own stuff. So when we consume ourselves, and I love that you said, Christina, that this person is so consumed with the illusion of what she believes other people's idea of perfection is. So trying to live into other people's standards is, well, we're raised into that, right? We're raised into pleasing our parents, pleasing our families, pleasing our teachers, pleasing our employers. We're raised into externalizing our value. And therefore, it's as a personal evolution and maturing, we get to look at our own values and living into our own values, and also recognizing when we have adopted the values of others, or and co-opted our own values in the process. So the conversation here, I just find it so interesting. I'm still piecing these things together, but I find it really fascinating how you can gain confidence when you do something that externally might look like lowering your standards. Okay, so let's talk about judgment here. So this person had a very high standard for themselves, right? An impossible standard. And I think that by um, that so many of us do have these impossible standards for ourselves. And so by lowering, when we have this impossible standard, we can't meet that standard. So we're constantly disappointing ourselves. And when we constantly disappoint ourselves, it erodes our trust in ourselves, right? So when we erode our trust in ourselves, then we lack confidence, or we lack that assurance that we can adapt and be resilient to circumstances. And when we lack trust in ourselves, we look to the external confirmation more than we would when we trust ourselves. When we trust ourselves, we can assess the external feedback and say, that applies, that doesn't apply. You know, we can be more discerning about external feedback. So it's ironic that by doing something that would conventionally be perceived as lowering our standards, we actually can breed confidence and self-trust and self-assurance. And from that, we can generate more inspired action. So I find it so fascinating, you know, to look at um, this notion of what might be perceived as lowering standards. It's not about lowering standards. It's about creating real standards rather than holding an impossible standard to that nobody can live into. So if you're holding an impossible standard, that is a way of oppressing yourself or allowing yourself to be oppressed. If everything always has to be right, if everything always has to be perfect, there is it's paralyzing. And so what we I took a number of, I've had a lot of different coaching experiences as a coachee. And one program I was in, the coach kept saying massive imperfect action. And the idea of massive imperfect action is that you actually get things done and you get to course correct along the way. And the primary foundation, or the expression of the confidence that underlies that, is that I can correct it, and I can course correct, and I can make adjustments. So Christina says, it's like with my husband's brain injury. Sometimes it feels like it takes 2 steps backwards to gain 3 steps forward. I feel for you, Christina. And tough road. And I love that there's still a step forward, you know, that the net gain in progress is forward. And we all get to learn from our mistakes. Now, making the same mistake over and over and over and over again and not learning from it, that's another story. And like you're saying, Christina, sometimes it takes learning it again and learning it again and learning it again in order for it to finally stick. And yes, so Christina's saying you have to tack a boat to get where you want to go. Yes, we're constantly course correcting. And what we get to do is look at our definitions of ourselves, our identities for ourselves, and our expectations that are inherent as part of those identities, so that we can create a context that allows us to flourish, and a context where there's no margin for error is not as a self-definition, like an always, all the time, is not an environment that allows us to flourish, because we're not we're perfectly imperfect beings. So I just I think that the other takeaway from this is when we allow ourselves to separate our value, our intrinsic worth from externalities, from our performance, from the money we make, from the education we have, from the job that we have, from the relationships that we have. When we are able to recognize our value as human beings simply by virtue of the fact that we're here and alive and a vehicle for life expressing itself, then we have the ability to source and express our true inspiration and our true sense of being. So Ra says, is the opposite of confidence insecurity? Someone who is insecure needs reassurance. So I think that insecurity is, well, it's the opposite of security, right? So insecurity is someone who is seeking outward validation, right? Outward validation or reassurance. And there we all have moments in our lives when we're feeling insecure about things. Um, and in those moments, we often do seek external validation. And that can be helpful. However, the ultimate security, I think the ultimate sense of confidence comes from this deep integrity, deep integration, deep self-trust. And that self-trust is something that we build over time also. So part of it is due to our definition of self, and part of it is due to being able to fulfill that definition in a way with confidence, with consistency. So again, when I have a definition of myself that I am worthy, I don't I don't need to make my worthiness dependent upon the externalities. So it may be the opposite of confidence is lack of self-trust. And I just put that out there. And what I mean by self-trust is the connection, and this goes into the integrity idea, the connection with your heart, and your internal inspiration. And so when we move from head to heart, there's a deeper integrity and a deeper access, I believe, to a knowing, or a connection with the world and with our core being, uh, and our core drive that allows for what would show up in the world more as confidence. Because somebody who has that self-trust not only can allow themselves to make mistakes, but to say things like, I don't know what that means. Can you explain that to me? Or I've never heard of that before. Um, can you share more? Um, to not have to be knowing all the time, to not have to be right all the time, to be able to, when there is that internal integrity, and we can have that internal integrity and internal trust and get blown off course periodically and then find our way back. Remember, it's constantly course correcting. But to be able to admit, wow, you know what, I was wrong about that, I'm sorry. Or I really, I apologize for the way I behaved, you know, and you can do that without feeling like, oh, I'm a horrible person, you know, or, oh, I did something wrong, I'm a horrible person. Because who you are is this alignment of integrity ultimately. And when we fall out of that alignment, we can course correct back to it and recognize that we diverted from it. You know, it's like, wow, I behaved in a way that I'm not proud of. I'm sorry. And I can say that in a way that doesn't make me a horrible person or doesn't have me have the experience of being a horrible person. So when we're talking about reassurance from outside, I think that we can elicit that reassurance, or we can elicit that feedback and use it as feedback and information. And ultimately, we need to gauge the impact of that external influence. We get to be discerning about the impact of it. So I'm hoping that answers or addresses what your question is, Ross. Um, yeah, I just find that this whole conversation is so interesting because it comes from what we construct in our minds, what we construct for the container that we live into, how we define the container we live into. And we get to make that container as constrictive or expansive as we choose. The thing is that we often don't even recognize that we've made that container, or that we've accepted a container that someone else has presented to us, and we've accepted it as our own, and then oppress ourselves with it. And so these different pieces coming together to result in an experience of confidence. It was alchemy. I'll say it was alchemy. It was a synthesis of of things that really on the surface might look contradictory. Um, and I find such wonder in exploring and discovering these weird and wonderful connections that make us who we are, make us who we are. So I think that's it for today. I'm so glad you played. Thank you for engaging with me. Ross says course correction with self-knowing resonates with me. I'm glad. Okay, good. I'm glad that that connects. I think it really comes back to connecting with our hearts, connecting with our own inner knowing and our inspiration, especially in these times when the feedback we get from the environment is often so crazy, right? So, anyway, this has been great. Thank you. And I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I show up here every weekday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern on the Enlightened World Facebook page. And I invite you to check out the community on Enlightened World on the Facebook page. Amazing healers and light workers, and people that are committed to evolution of our consciousness and our humanity on the planet. So with lots and lots of love, thank you so much for joining me, and I really look forward to playing again with you here soon. Take care.